A science narrative is a story of everyone. It puts everyone in our species on an equal footing by showing how we all got here. That makes the science narrative fit perfectly with equality, diversity, and inclusion. If you web search for EDI, you'll find a lot of policies of businesses and universities where people are actively searching for a shared narrative for their groups that everyone can participate in by talking about life as they know it. That's a good start. But businesses and universities are organizations that exist to achieve some goal. So even without intending to, the people in those organizations focus their efforts on figuring out what EDI means as it relates to their goals. That means better relations with their employees and customers to help them make more money, or overcoming obstacles to people getting education, or whatever it happens to be. Theater, which is what I work in, takes the ideas of EDI all the way. Professional theater is a business, but more than that, it's the art of recreating the entire world and as many variations on it as people can imagine. You make a story personally meaningful to someone by making them feel like they have important things in common with the protagonists. The highest level of success in the art is to be able to make anyone's story personally meaningful to anyone else. In his book, The Descent of Man, in 1871, Charles Darwin proposed how the theory of evolution could be used to study human psychology. In his final book, The Expressions of Emotions in Man and Animals, he got some actors to collaborate with him to describe different emotions. But it took 120 more years for people to develop the information processing technology that made the field of evolutionary psychology possible. In the 1880s, a Russian actor and director named Konstantin Stanislavski started his career. At that point, the theater industry had existed for 24 centuries, but no one had ever figured out how to make acting look realistic. People had figured out different ways of making acting interesting, but their performances never looked like people in real life. Think about how fake the actors always look in TV commercials. And now imagine everyone in every movie acting like that all the time. That's basically what the theater industry was when Stanislavski started. He realized that one problem was that actors were using stereotypes of people that they and their audiences believed in. Another was that they were actively trying to make their audiences feel what they wanted them to feel about their performances. But in real life, people have their own reasons for doing whatever they do. People have universal human motivations, but they act differently on those motivations because of their different personalities, life experiences, and other situational factors. All of those factors combined make everything a person does internally self-consistent. We empathize with each other the most in the long run when we see how other people are acting on the same motivations we have. He made many discoveries over his 50-year career and wrote 4 long books about them. The most important of his discoveries can be worded like this: everyone always makes the best decisions they can think of in the situation they're in for themselves and the people they care about. Everyone always tries to use their energy as efficiently as possible to succeed at their goals. 90% of human mental activity is subconscious. The behavior of any one person is always some number of steps removed from the behavior of any other person. These discoveries were enough for people who had the talent and dedication to work in theater to build their characters up from universal human motivations to specific, internally self-consistent applications of them as personalities and combinations of life experiences that make the characters make the decisions they make in the situations they're in over the course of the play. That made the actors' performances more powerful overall by letting the audiences empathize with them the way they empathize with people in real life. The Stanislavski system works very well in Shakespearean theater, even though Shakespeare lived about 250 years before Stanislavski. From this, we can see that Shakespeare understood the same things and used them in his writing, even though he didn't figure out how to explain them to anyone else. He wrote in poetry that no one ever uses in real life, but it's easy for actors to give all of his characters internally self-consistent feelings that motivate the decisions they make over the course of the play. The Stanislavski system doesn't work as well in Gilbert and Sullivan theater because their plays are basically cartoons. Their main goal was to use music as social and political commentary, so they don't devote much of their scripts to the development of individual characters. All the stage time they devote to songs where the actors repeat the same lines 20 times, make the songs memorable, but don't introduce the audience to new information about the characters. But you can still use the Stanislavski system to find personalities for the characters that give them internally self-consistent reasons for the decisions they make. Stanislavski is the reason we take realistic acting for granted in movies today. Ironically, his work was so successful that today people hardly ever talk about him because his discoveries have become the normal way to create movies, which doesn't need a name. Another reason his name isn't better known is because he lived in Russia, and the Russian Revolution happened in the middle of his career. When Stalin found out about Stanislavski's insights into human behavior, the government started telling him what kind of work he could create. Stanislavski retired from theater soon after that and started writing his books. But he had to write different books for publication in the US and the Soviet Union. His friend who translated his books into English didn't translate them literally. She adapted their content to try to make them more understandable to American audiences at the time. His work wasn't retranslated until after the Cold War ended. Also, he died before he finished his third book, Building a Character. The rest of that book and his entire fourth book, Creating a Role, are just collections of notes and rough drafts. He got his discoveries into the theater industry and revolutionized it worldwide, but he had to be a lot less direct in doing it than he would have if he'd been an American. About a century after Stanislavski started his career, the science of evolutionary psychology was founded on three first principles. All human behavior is the product of the attempt by the individual to maximize the survival rate of his or her genes. 90% of human mental activity is subconscious, and all human mental activity evolved in or before the Stone Age. The first of those principles is what makes evolutionary psychology a science, because it expresses how numbers show patterns of cause and effect. That's how the selfish gene theory, which was discovered in the 1970s, plays out in human psychology. The selfish gene theory is how the theory of evolution, as expressed by Charles Darwin, plays out in biochemistry. Darwin's discovery that species evolve because of the survival rates of characteristics means the survival rates of the genes that create the characteristics. Human mental activity evolved the same way every trait of every species evolved, because it gave the individuals who had it the highest survival rates of their genes. Our brains, and those of all other animals, evolved to make us recognize choices that helped our ancestors survive and reproduce in the conditions of our evolution. Stanislavski encompassed the concept of survival rates of genes with his principles that everyone always makes the best decisions they can think of in the situations they're in for themselves and the people they care about, and people always try to use their energy as efficiently as possible to succeed at their goals. That's what the first of the first principles of evolutionary psychology looks like from the outside. He doesn't mention genes specifically, but that's not necessary. Charles Darwin discovered evolution without knowing about genes. Evolutionary psychologists agree with Stanislavski that most of human mental activity is subconscious. We understand what that means now better than people did a century ago, but his work got started on the right track. Stanislavski didn't figure out what the Stone Age origins of humanity meant specifically, but he did encompass that with his idea of everyone's behavior being some number of steps removed from that of anyone else. He called this the magic if. Imagine your life being exactly the same as it is now, except for one difference. Once you get accustomed to that, add another difference, then another. If you have enough information to work with, step by step, you can visualize realistic behavior for people at some other time in history, in some other part of the world, or a futuristic or fantasy setting. The Stone Age is the origin of our universal motivations and our last common point of reference with everyone in the world. Backing up through history to where your ideas about life diverged from someone else's might mean backing all the way up to the Stone Age. Stanislavski developed his style to make fiction realistic, but his style can also be used to make nonfiction understandable. To make a movie that compares two people, or the people of two cultures, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, you have to show how they're similar and the sources of their differences. You can do that with people who live at Stone Age technological levels today, just like you can with anyone else. It just takes more time and effort because Stone Age people's situations are so far removed from those of the audience. Anthropologists and evolutionary psychologists have learned a lot about this part of the puzzle by studying people who live at Stone Age technological levels today. But there's another way to see this play out right here in the US, if you have the opportunity. Usually when people talk about the Stone Age, they talk about it as if it's a long forgotten past. But that's only because it is in Europe. The development of farming in the Middle East led to the developments of metalworking and writing. All of those spread into Europe from there. But farming and metalworking were developed long before writing. The written history of that part of the world, which is the oldest written history in the world, starts with people herding and farming in the Bronze Age. Here in the Americas, the Stone Age lasted until at least 1492. On the West Coast, it lasted into the 1800s. In some people's family histories, including mine, the Stone Age is more recent than the American Revolution. But here's the problem. There are about 5 million Native Americans in the US today. That's a lot of people, but it's less than 2% of our population. These people and their cultures are only a few hundred years removed from the Stone Age. Life in Europe in 1492 was a lot different from the Stone Age. That means a very small group of people have a lot of ideas that are very different from everyone else. That makes them easy to ignore. That leads to another problem. Natives have worked hard to come as far as they have in being recognized as people with their own history and identity. A lot of people want to help them. But because there are so few natives, it's easy for people who think they're helping to turn natives into a fad and ignore what they're really saying. I have a lot to say about natives sometimes, so I just want to be clear that everything I say is either stuff natives have already said or my own direct observations. Natives today, being 500 years or less removed from the Stone Age, doesn't tell us anything about the Stone Age directly. It's just a very good opportunity to see how different cultures have evolved from our Stone Age origins. Even native history doesn't show us the Stone Age directly. It shows us hundreds of different ways people adapted to life in the Stone Age. And one last disclaimer. A lot of natives don't like being lumped together into one group, as if their ancestors all lived in teepees and hunted buffalo and said, "How?" A lot of stereotypes of natives are the result of cowboy movies, which were mostly set on the Great Plains. That's why you can dress up like an Indian for Halloween and everyone will know what you are, but when was the last time you heard of someone dressing up like a black person or a white person or an Asian or a Mexican for Halloween? But there are some things that natives have in common which you can talk about if you talk in general enough terms, like you would if you wanted to talk about things Irish people and Bulgarians had in common because they're Europeans. Here are 5 simple things I've noticed. First, let's get the obvious one out of the way. White history doesn't have a native equivalent of 1492. Europe has never been invaded by an unstoppable group of people who reduced its white population to 1%. The United States government has never had policies for exterminating white people or confining them to prison camps, called reservations. These are historical facts, but the facts seem to mean different things depending on whether they happen to your ancestors or they happen to someone else's ancestors. Second, at a Stone Age technological level, the most powerful weapons you have for hunting animals are bows, arrows, spears, and fire. That means there's a lot less physical difference between you and a deer, elk, moose, buffalo, cougar, wolf, or bear than most people today assume there is. Since wild animals wander around the same places you do, and some of them can kill you as easily as you can kill them, you can't afford to think of them as a separate category of life from you. They're your neighbors. And since you see wild animals so often, you can learn a lot about people by seeing similarities between things people and animals do. Once you learn to see similarities between people and animals, it's easier to see similarities among people. That makes it easier to talk about life in terms that include yourself, the person you're talking to, and other people. If you go to an event where natives of a lot of different nations, meaning native nations, are talking to each other, you might think the way they talk about life sounds vague. That might make you think they haven't thought about what they're saying as much as you would have thought about it, and that might make them seem disorganized or immature. But if you look around the room at all the people from all their different backgrounds who agree with what the person is saying, you might realize that they're doing something you don't know how to do. They're creating sincere emotional connections across cultural boundaries. But that doesn't seem like a valuable skill to people whose groups are powerful enough to get what they want without the help of other people. You can see this happen in my Defending the Sacred series.
Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to my homeland. I am Oz. My name is Carlin Barahan. I was taught the old ways when I was a boy. Like all boys, I did not want to listen. They taught us to read the mountains, to read the rocks that were written long ago, just as you sat in school.
Third, at a Stone Age technological level, writing hasn't been invented yet. People who don't know how to write books can't build up libraries of information. But neither can they get into wars over different interpretations of their books. Nor can they build up academic fields where people don't realize that factually incorrect information has been entrenched for generations and where leaders in the field base their careers on believing it. Writing lets us organize more information than we can by trying to remember it all personally, and that gives us an overall benefit to understanding the world. But people who don't depend on writing can change their minds more easily. People who do depend on writing have a term for that. They call it people's memories aren't dependable. What they leave out of that saying is that the world we live in is dependable. When you see the need to create sincere emotional connections across cultural boundaries, you learn to talk in terms of ideas you can depend on strangers having thought of also. On the other hand, if you belong to a group of people who are powerful enough to get what they want without anyone else's help, you can afford to believe that nobody outside your group has ever had any good ideas at all. If you're somewhere in between, you can acknowledge other people's good ideas or ignore them, depending on which is more convenient for you. Native Americans often have trouble getting their traditional religions recognized as religions under the freedom of religion because so many people in the U.S. equate religion with Christianity and things that are similar to Christianity. Organized religion depends on writing. Societies that don't have writing don't have sacred texts for their religions. Sacred texts seem to give religions legitimacy because they give people a sense of continuity by letting them feel like they believe the same things people believed thousands of years ago. If your religion consists entirely of the life experience of people in your society and stories that grandparents tell their grandchildren, it's very adaptable to changing times, but it won't look like a religion to people who value dogma.
But when we are related, we must go beyond that essence of the two-legged and remind ourselves that the most prolific relation is the mother, the water people, the tree people, rock people, and all that is creation.
Fourth, at a Stone Age technological level, people have to be more versatile. People today can pursue careers in fields most people have never heard of. They can afford to think about life that way because they can plan on using their money to buy everything else they need at the store. At a Stone Age technological level, a lot of the things that make our lives easier today haven't been invented yet, which means you have to know how to do more things for yourself. But our education system is set up to train people for specialized fields. As you go from a high school diploma to an associate's degree, to a bachelor's degree, to a master's degree, to a doctoral degree, your education prepares you for a career where you'll be recognized as more and more of an expert at something. And the higher your degree, the more you're recognized for being smart and working hard. But if you value knowing a lot about different things, there is no PhD program for that, no matter how smart you are or how hard you work. If there was, I'd have signed up for it a long time ago. So our cultural values in the U.S. don't recognize as valuable the types of intelligence that much of life in the Stone Age depended on. Fifth, have you ever noticed how boring Eurocentric clothes are? When people invent new fashions for men's fancy clothing, all they're talking about are new colors and fabrics and slightly different designs of the same old pattern of a button-up shirt, a suit jacket, pants, shoes, a tie, and maybe a vest. Powwows happen every weekend in the U.S., and they live stream them on powwows.com. Look at the fancy clothes people wear there. They seem to have started out with a completely different idea of what clothes are even for. Basically, any part of your body can be covered in beads, feathers, bones, ribbons, bells, animal hides, or anything else you can find. To see white people put that much creativity into what they wear, you have to go to Burning Man. Equality, diversity, and inclusion depends on looking at what people do in terms of how they're trying to succeed at their goals. If you want to take that another step and actively search for a new narrative, you can put yourself in different situations so you can get an idea of what life is like for people who live that way all the time and get to know people who have a lot of experience with living that way. In theater, that's called method acting. When anthropologists do it, they call it participant observation. These are some examples of things I've learned from spending time around natives. But everyone who does something rare or controversial has a story to tell about how acting upon the same basic motivations everyone else has led them to do something very different from the things most people do. Over the course of my adventures, I've made friends with, gone out with, almost married, or otherwise gotten to know a convicted murderer, a wealthy heiress, political prisoners, former crack dealers, crack addicts, heroin addicts, meth addicts, marijuana growers, a former arsonist, a former armed robber, a former car thief, former gang members, the son of an organized crime family, a daughter of a religious cult, a vigilante, a retired police chief, military veterans, the first black sailor ever to serve aboard a U.S. submarine, Vietnamese refugees, Yugoslav refugees, homeless people, mentally ill people, suicidal people, child abuse survivors, rape survivors, quadriplegics and other people who are physically disabled, people with terminal illnesses, a woman whose father died by medical malpractice, a woman who almost died by medical malpractice, a guy who died of an easily treatable medical condition because he couldn't afford health insurance, a guy who was injured in a car accident and was driven to alcoholism after he couldn't afford his pain medication anymore, a woman who had a genius IQ but had to have parts of her brain removed to treat her epilepsy, a guy who had to have parts of his brain removed to treat his seizures and lost years of his memory, a neurologist who suffered brain damage in a car accident, a guy who had a genius IQ and dyslexia who didn't learn to read until he was 26 and was admitted to Harvard the following year, a guy who got framed for child pornography by a computer hacker and faced 100 years in prison, a former deputy of Phoenix's internationally infamous Sheriff Joe Arpaio who helped blow the whistle on his human rights abuses, Mexican immigrants, including at least one illegal immigrant, a former pimp, strippers, a prostitute, porn stars, photographers and movie directors, drag kings and queens, transvestites, transsexuals, polyamorous people, sadomasochists, the original drummer of Iron Butterfly, a former leader of the Black Panther Self-Defense Party, communists, revolutionary anarchists, Mormon missionaries, Europeans, and many other people with diverse perspectives whose titles are much less dramatic, like homosexuals, bikers, theoretical physicists, and vegans. I'm not bragging. This is just what I have to say after my name instead of PhD to mean I've worked hard to develop a rare and valuable point of view on something important. So subscribe to my channel if you haven't already and stay tuned for more videos.